So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear us and see us clearly. As you can see, the recording has already started, but before we begin with today's session, with today's webinar, I would like to introduce you to a very useful tool that you can use in case of any language difficulties. It's the captions tool. With this tool, basically, you're able to add subtitles and live caption to this event. To do so, as you can see in your screens, probably, hope so, please click on the button More at the bar on the top of your screen, then move to Language and Speech and click Live Captions. You can also install this function by again clicking the button More, then click on Settings and turn on the captions in the accessibility section. Of course, if you have any questions, please let us know in the chat. And I think we're ready to start with the main content of this webinar. Good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you for attending this session, this webinar basically offered by the European School Education Platform, the European Commission's platform for school education in Europe. My name is Maria Elena. Some of you might be familiar with my face, but for those who are not, I will be the hostess of this session. Again, this is a recorded webinar, and all the material will be uploaded on the European School Education Platform in the coming days. My colleague Marta here in the chat will post the website of this webinar where you will be able to find the material. So, before we begin, I would like to also remind you of another important, let's say, technicality. Following the General Data Protection Regulations, your microphones and your cameras have been disabled. However, we strongly encourage you and invite you to share any thoughts or questions through the chat. Also, we kindly ask you not to share any personal information during this webinar. Instead, you can always use the Connect tab on the European School Education Platform for partner finding and collaborations. We invite you to stay with us until the very end of this webinar to learn about what's coming next on the European School Education Platform, and of course, provide us with your feedback through a very short evaluation survey. With no further delays, I would like to introduce you to our speaker. Today we have the honor of welcoming Eric Wilberding. Eric is the head of Philosophy and Theory of Knowledge Department at Marymount International School. Beyond his leadership role, Eric has a deep passion for philosophy, specializing in the Socratic Method. He has authored 2 books on the subject and has been a featured speaker at numerous seminars. Together, we will explore this thought-provoking questioning technique first developed in ancient Greece by the philosopher Socrates. Our discussion will delve into its core principles, and we will examine how it can be effectively adapted to scaffold group discussions in the classroom. With no further delays, I would like to give the floor to Eric. Eric, please, you can share your screen.
Okay. Are you able to put it back up from where it was before? It was shared. Otherwise, I can go without the PowerPoint.
Give me a second. I will stop sharing mine so you can start sharing it again as we did it before. If it doesn't work, of course, feel free to share your screen. It's how it's more convenient for you. In the meantime, until you upload it, maybe people can say a few words about themselves. I can see here in the chat some input. I see people coming from Jordan, Albania, Greece, Romania. Let me see if we have more here. Again, Romania, Turkey, Germany. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're just taking a moment until Eric uploads his presentation or share his screen. Of course, sometimes this might take a bit of time. In the meantime, maybe you can let us know if you have any previous experience on the topic. Have you ever used this, let's say, questioning technique with your students? Have you thought how it could enhance their critical thinking? Give us your input, your thoughts on this. Let's maybe we can start a very small discussion in the chat while we are waiting for the presentation to be uploaded. I see people from Italy, Georgia, Armenia, Turkey again here, Croatia. Hello, everyone. It's so interesting to see so many people from across Europe and not only
here we
Europe.
go.
Okay, we are ready.
Okay, so is this showing well?
Yes, Eric, perfectly. You're on the second slide. We can see the second slide now.
Okay, this is perfect. Okay, so I mean, this goes to the introduction which you graciously gave, and simply the two books that I authored on the Socratic Method, and there is material for a third book, as well as the TED Ed video in which I collaborated a couple of years ago, and is doing very well on YouTube and on the TED Ed site. The Socratic Method is an extraordinarily rich manner of teaching, directly engaging with students. There is constant checking for understanding. And so I think it is a very, very useful tool for any teacher within the classroom, regardless of whether one's teaching elementary school or secondary school or university or postgraduate, professional school. It really is a kind of multi-purpose teaching tool, which is immensely useful, and it's very rewarding to learn about it. Okay, now in terms of what we will do this afternoon in our hour, I'll give you a brief introduction to Socrates and his method. I don't want to take this for granted, and perhaps people haven't grazed up against Socrates or looked at his life or what he's doing within his dialogues. So it seems, as it were, as a kind of forced move to make sure that we are on equal footing, more or less, on who the man is, what is his method. We'll talk about the aim of the Socratic method, which has to do with analysis, with evaluation, with what Bloom called higher level thinking. Okay, then we'll look at the specific elements of the Socratic method, which can be transposed into different domains of learning, into different classrooms, according to what you are teaching, according to what kind of analysis, what kind of judgments you are trying to bring out. Okay, now then we'll look concretely, what do I bring into the classroom? And then we'll look at, towards the end, where can it go wrong? It's always, one has to be highly aware as one is teaching, that there is the connection, that there is understanding developing, that there is worthwhile exploration of the problem, of the open question. And so, one has to make sure that you are on the path, that as it were. And so where can it go wrong is very, very important to think about basically every single class, okay? And then we'll think about in the conclusion, why is this worthwhile? We'll review that, and we'll talk about how, mostly when you want to be the midwife, sometimes one wants to be the gadfly, to be more provocative, to be more challenging, to bring out other facets, other perspectives on the, of the particular lesson, the question, the problem, as it were. Okay, and so this is the overview. This is our roadmap. Okay, and so next, let me see if I can advance here. All right, now, in looking at portraits of Socrates, okay, if you look at portraits in mosaics, in paintings, on gems, ancient gems, if you look at sculpture, which are probably the most common portraits, you can see that there is a variety of likenesses. Okay, and so these all probably go back, if one listens to the art historians, to two prototypes, two approaches, two portraits of Socrates, but nonetheless, even granted that, one sees a variety of likenesses, different perspectives, different understandings arising from different contexts. Okay, so I think that this artistically, as it were, is analogous to how there have been different understandings, different perspectives on the Socratic method. Okay, so one sees it emerging within Greece, spontaneously with Socrates, okay, who had his own antecedents. We won't explore that today, but there are antecedents for Socrates' use of questions. And after that, it's going to be transposed in different ways across the centuries and in different domains. And it's much more traceable as we go beyond the Renaissance, when we'll see the paths which emerge and which continue to be trodden upon, in 2025. Okay, so the diverse portraits that we see are very, very analogous, as I say, to the diverse understandings of what is the Socratic method. There is not one Socratic method. There are Socratic methods, is really, I think, a very, very key understanding. Okay, now, basically, what we can see regarding Socrates is that he's born around 469 BCE in Athens. His father is a stone carver. His mother is a midwife, and that is significant for a metaphor for himself later on. He is trained as a stone carver. In the ancient world, there was a statue of three graces that was attributed to him. He becomes interested in philosophy and is interested in questions concerning the natural world, but becomes frustrated with that and begins to ask, what is the good life? What is the good life? And so he begins to look at questions regarding morality or ethics and trying to understand fundamental questions. What is justice? What is temperance? What is virtue? And in doing this, he's engaging with other people in conversations everywhere. Okay, so one sees within the works of Plato, for example, that he's doing this in the agora, he's doing this in shops, he's doing this in the palestra, he's doing this on walks. I mean, anywhere and everywhere, he's having conversations with people, which are structured basically with questions. Okay, so he was an indefatigable and relentless searcher for the truth. And he claimed that he didn't know anything, and this is a fundamental point, but he did, as it were, have some very, very refined tools for gaining some understanding of what he didn't know, as it were. Okay, and so how do we know about him is basically through the works of two of his disciples, Plato and Xenophon, about whom more in shortly, who were followers of him. Okay, so he did have a following of young Athenians of diverse walks of life. He became very popular in a very, very fascinating way. He also participated very well within the life of Athens, going off to war as a hoplite, participating in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta and its league. And so he demonstrated physical courage, and the Athenians were aware of this. Okay, and I think it added to his fascination. Now, eventually, he is brought up on charges at the end of his life for corrupting the youth, perhaps through his insistence in imparting a very, very pointed way of questioning, as well as for impiety. And so he's placed famously on trial. He defends himself, and there are different sort of representations of his defense by Xenophon and by Plato. Nonetheless, he is condemned by a narrow margin, and following the Athenian law, not deciding to run away and go into exile, as it were, or just into hiding, he famously drinks hemlock and, as it were, commits suicide in the year 399 BC. So that is the short life of Socrates, a life very much devoted to being a teacher, even though he claimed not to be a teacher, and that he had, as it were, no corpus of knowledge to impart to others. Okay, and so it's very paradoxical in a sense that one of history's greatest teachers claimed not to be a teacher, and yet his way of questioning and bringing forth understanding in students in all sorts of different contexts continues to be so compelling even today in 2025. Okay, now, how do we know about his method? Okay, now his method emerges for us in the works of Xenophon and in the works of Plato. Okay, so Xenophon was a young man who becomes a general. He goes off on a very, very famous expedition to Persia when Socrates is at, in his final act, as it were. So Xenophon doesn't witness that, yet nonetheless, when he returns, he's writing works about Socrates, which show one facet of the philosopher's opinion in one take on his Socratic method. And certain passages of the memoirs of Socrates are very famous demonstrations of how the Socratic method is done. However, the preferred source of many philosophers is the works of Plato. Okay, so Plato was an extraordinarily brilliant mind who came under the spell of Socrates, who was, who basically was a close follower, writing dialogues, even when Socrates was alive, and drawing some wry comments from Socrates on that. And following the philosopher's death, Socrates very often appears in the dialogues of Plato to enunciate different points of view. But in the earlier dialogues of Plato, we see his method done with great accomplishment. And so those dialogues in particular are very, very effective sources for us. And so one way of learning about Socratic method is through looking at, reading the works of Plato and Xenophon, keeping in mind, however, that both of these, Xenophon, but especially Plato, are highly refined literary interpretations. Okay, so Plato had an extraordinary mind, complex, nuanced. I mean, he's creating great works of art in these dialogues. And what you have, as you read, are these seamless, flawless philosophical discussions in which everything is important. The setting, the people, the fundamental questions. I mean, the baton is never dropped. I mean, you have this very graceful race to a particular finish line, and it's a work of art. It simply is a work of art. And so while one sees, as it were, Socratic moves within the dialogues, you have to keep in mind that if you're going to transpose the method to real life, you're not going to have the same sort of seamless, flawless aesthetic objects, within discussion, because discussion can be, it can be messy. There'll be misunderstandings. You'll need to clarify. I mean, as one does more of it, it can obviously become more adept and, skillful. But, nonetheless, you have to keep in mind there is the literary work of Plato and Xenophon. Then there are discussions in real life, which will have their own characteristics, as it were. Okay, so you will see the Socratic moves within these dialogues, these written dialogues from the ancient world, but then you transpose those into a living environment, and there will be similarities, obviously, and there will be a drive for greater understanding and the achieving of greater understanding, but there is a difference. Okay, so you shouldn't, obviously, it would be unrealistic to think of the dialogues of the ancient world as verbatim transcripts. They simply are not that. Now, one thing which I would encourage everyone to do, if you haven't done this already, is to read some of these dialogues. You don't have to read all the dialogues of Plato. That would take a little bit of time, but to look at least at, say, the Euthyphro, to look at the Apology, to look at the Meno, to look at the memoirs of Socrates by Xenophon. This would be very, very helpful, that you could see the works of these great thinkers and have an understanding of what this literary representation of Socratic method is. Now, in looking at Socrates in the works of Plato, in particular, three images emerge, three helpful images for how the Socratic method may impact us within the classroom. Now, the first of these is the midwife, which is the image on the left. All right. Now, as I said, Socrates' mother was a midwife. Okay. Now, in Plato's Theaetetus, which is an immensely sophisticated dialogue about the nature of knowledge, Socrates, towards the beginning, says that he conceives of himself as a midwife. Okay. And so he was helping others to birth their ideas in order to determine whether it is a very good idea or a very bad idea. And he's going to be doing this, obviously, through questions. Okay, and so Socrates regarded himself as being a midwife, and this is the source of the term maieutic, which some of you have probably heard. Maieutic questioning means midwife questioning. Okay, so the midwife is one very effective image, one very effective metaphor for understanding how Socratic method emerges within the classroom. Okay, so one is helping students to give birth to their ideas, and one is seeing through the application of criteria, through application to different situations, whether or not it is a strong idea, or it is a weaker idea. It seems to fail in some regard. All right. So the midwife, I think, is the basic mindset for the teacher most of the time within the classroom. Now, the next image, the gadfly, can also be very, very helpful in different moments. Okay, so the gadfly, this image comes out of Plato's Apology. Socrates famously claims that he is the gadfly and the noble steed of Athens, and so he is stinging the noble steed, the horse, in order to spur it to greater action. Okay, so here one is being provocative, one is being challenging in order to, as it were, increase the reasoning, the reflection, the analysis, the judgment of the students. So the gadfly is sort of being provocative, and also it could be annoying, but one has to keep this, as it were, within check. Now the last image, the torpedo fish, is a very, very famous image. And I think in most classrooms, this particular representation of Socratic method won't be helpful. Okay, some argue for it, but I tend to think that it's when one is better off with the midwife and sometimes gadfly. All right, so basically the torpedo fish stings stings someone, and they feel numb, they feel disoriented, they feel confused. Okay, and this is the aporia, the impasse, which many people felt within Plato's dialogues at the end of the dialogue. Okay, and so they will feel disoriented, and they understand fundamentally that they don't understand. Okay, and so they feel confused, but the revelation is that at the beginning of the dialogue, they were confused, but they didn't realize it. They thought they knew something, and through the dialogue, through questioning, looking at different definitions, looking at different explanations and seeing the consequences and so forth, at the end, they realize, wow, I really don't know this. Okay, and so that is that's one possible destination for Socratic method. I think in general, students want to reach a destination. And for some, this could be to leave the students at this point at the end of the period, as it were, so that they continue to think about it outside of class, and through further reflection, they're able, as it were, to come to a more personal understanding. So these are three basic settings for Socratic method. There is the midwife setting, in which one is helping students to bring forth their ideas, their convictions, and to test them. Okay, there is the gadfly, where one is being challenging and provocative in order to help students to look at other perspectives, usually to which they're not accustomed. And then finally, there is the torpedo fish, in which one is somehow leaving the students disoriented, confused, numb. And that's not a good place to be. I mean, one is going for instruction, but one works out one's own understanding of the Socratic method. Perhaps that will be a useful phase within your particular manifestation of it. Okay. So what is the aim of the Socratic method? I think perhaps we've already mentioned this, but it is not for conveying information. Okay, so it is one method amidst a gamut of different teaching methods within the world today in 2025. I mean, we're in a sense living in a very, very fortunate moment just in terms of pedagogy, because there's simply so many ways to teach. Okay, and so these are developed often with great reflection and testing and so forth over recent decades. But basically, the aim of Socratic method is not for conveying information. Okay, it is for analyzing, it is for evaluating, it is for perhaps creating new knowledge, going beyond what one has already understood, in order to sort of apply it to new situations. So in other words, as Benjamin Bloom called it more than a half a century ago, we're looking for higher order thinking, higher level thinking, higher order thinking, which is analysis, synthesis, evaluation, or judgment. So it is par excellence, I think, a manner of instilling and bringing out critical reasoning, critical thinking. Okay, now that term gets bandied about, and which is a good thing, I imagine. But what critical thinking really means is that one is reasoning logically, okay, with fair judgment. Okay, so the word critical goes back to a Latin word, back to a Greek word, referring to a judge, to judgment. Okay, so one in critical thinking is learning to reason logically, consistently, okay, but with good judgment, with fair judgment. And the Socratic method is a very, very effective tool for bringing that out. It's something which is, I think, enormously, enormously useful. Okay, so let's go forward a little bit more. Basically, all right, let's look at some of the elements of the Socratic method. Some of the elements of the Socratic method. Okay, so the first is, I think, the midwife mindset. Okay, so a lot of this has to do with going into the classroom with the attitude, with the behavior that one is helping students to bring out what they believe, what they think. Okay, so in many moments, the teacher really becomes a student. The teacher becomes the student or appears to become the student. Okay, so this is a very clever piece of advice from Jean Leclerc, who was explaining Socratic method more than 300 years ago. And he said, basically, you know, the teacher must appear to become the student, and you're trying to draw out what the other person thinks. The other person is trying to teach you what they understood, what they understand. Okay, now part of this too has to do with establishing a climate within the classroom for conversation. And so the students have to feel comfortable. Okay, they have to feel comfortable. So one does not pounce. Okay, I mean, it's something which, you know, for whatever reason, you know, that a teacher can hear a mistaken response, that pounce correct, correct the person in what they've said. And, you know, you have to restrain yourself if that's necessary, you know, and give the students room to express what they think, and then see where it goes. Okay, and so that's going to take, there'll be different boundaries for that within different domains, but that's very important. All right, so if you have a student raise their hand and they say, "Can I say what I think?" You know, this is a very, very telling remark, because you can see that they often are self-censoring. And, you know, you need to get, if you want to teach authentically, the students have to feel comfortable in expressing what their ideas are, what their interpretations are. Okay. And of course, as I say, this will have, different boundaries within different domains. I mean, if you're a math teacher, you're not getting so much into interpretation. If you're a history teacher, you do more in that sort of thing. But the students need to be very, very comfortable. So you cannot be judgmental. There's no need for that. Okay, you have to, as it were, create the climate where the students feel comfortable in saying what they think, And that is eternally true. Now, the pace of the conversation should not be too fast. Okay, I'm kind of talking fast now, so I'm aware of this. You have to keep it, at a pace in which people can process. They can process what they think and they can express it. Okay, so if one is agile verbally, then this can be even a fault in Socratic teaching, because you don't want to be sort of very quick with a few students. You want to really bring out the conversation with the entire classroom. Okay, now another characteristic is that one is using problems, one is using scenarios, one is using open questions. John Dewey, a very famous thinker about education from more than 100 years ago, at least in this particular book, famously said that critical thinking begins with problems. Okay, you have to encounter a problem, and then one begins to think more critically as a result of that, in order to figure out what is the problem and then what a possible solution to that could be. Daniel Kahneman, in his very, very famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, introduced the idea of dual processing, okay, in which you have a very fast system, which is automatic, intuitive, emotional, given to making judgments, and then a slow system, okay? And so you want to have the slow system, which is more deliberate, which is more logical, which is more careful as you are figuring out these problems. Now, another characteristic, very, very famous, which you've probably already heard of, is Socratic ignorance. So this is going back to the idea that Socrates claimed to know nothing. Okay, he claimed that he did not know, and he's trying to learn from the other person. Now, there can be irony in this, but there is also some very profound pedagogical insight. That is, if one is not giving answers, then you're creating space for the students to create the answers, to bring out their answers, and then to examine them. Okay. Now, after this, structured questioning. Now, this is very, very important for Socratic method, I think, because basically where it emerges, you are instilling a manner of questioning which is appropriate to the domain, All right. So, for example, two of the more famous instances of Socratic method are within legal education, at least within the United States, which has waned in the last couple of decades, but which is still a feature. One can find some very extraordinary writing about this by Heather Gerken, among others. You have structured questioning in which one is bringing out the reasoning of students through the suggestion of hypotheticals. So when it's trying to understand and test legal reasoning in different, for different cases, by means of comparisons, by means of analogies, and some very, very fine distinctions can be brought out with that. Similarly, within clinical education, which means the education of doctors who are diagnosing illnesses and trying to find, what is the proper therapy for them, you have structured questioning, which is looking at basically summarizing the history or the clinical findings, within the test, which is proposing different explanations for this, okay, and which is analyzing one of them, comparing and contrasting it with other possible explanations, and so forth. So you find structured questioning within clinical education, which is narrowing down one's understanding of the illness and popular and possible, cures for that. Now, one entertaining manifestation of this, as you may or may not know, is on the TV show, which is which one can find on Netflix or wherever, House MD, in which Dr. Gregory House, played by the very funny and often eloquent actor Hugh Laurie, as Dr. House is leading his team of diagnosticians through understanding different illnesses. And one of the episodes in season 1, episode 21, is exactly about the Socratic method in a very dramatic and very effective way. And so, they're trying to basically understand a hypothetical case, and he continues to add variations to it as that unfolds in order to deepen the student's understanding of what can happen within such things. All right. And so structured questioning will take different forms within different domains. Okay. So it's going to mean one thing within mathematics, okay, in which there will be a process of questioning in order to bring out the reasoning to solve a particular problem. Okay, Socratic method in mathematics goes all the way back to Plato. So within the Meno, in the second part of the dialogue, Socrates, who historically was not that interested in math, but nonetheless Plato, who was, Socrates leads a slave boy through a problem of geometry by means of questioning. Okay, and so they're looking at different understandings, and there is some frustration, but then in the end, he's able to solve the geometric problem. So applying the Socratic method to math has perhaps, has a very, apart from ethics, it has a very, very long history. Now, George Polya, who was a Hungarian mathematician, very brilliant man who taught at Stanford for decades and published a very famous book, How to Solve It, which is still in print after many, many decades, was a very Socratic teacher. And he wrote about this and how one structures questions to help the student to reason through a problem and to understand a process of reasoning which can be applied to approaching other problems. All right. Now, if you look up George Polya on YouTube, you can actually see a lesson that he taught in 1966. Okay, and it is very instructive. It's very, very instructive how he approaches the teaching of those graduate students who are so happy to hear from him. All right, so moving on, cold calling. Now, cold calling has to be done, in the right way, frankly. Cold calling means that one is randomly calling on students, and it is a way of teaching groups, okay, which Socrates obviously did not do. Socrates was instructing individuals. He was bringing out the ideas, the convictions, the network of ideas of different individuals, but he was not engaging with a group, sort of moderating a discussion of different points of view in order to reach a new understanding. However, we are most of the time, okay? So unless one is tutoring, that's a different case, but cold calling is one way of helping everyone to stay alert within the classroom, and also at its best, I think, of bringing out of the students the best of what they can do within the classroom, okay, and challenging to do more. Okay, so cold calling means calling on students for different pieces of the puzzle, as it were, as one is examining a particular issue and so forth. So my own aim within the classroom is to call on everyone in the classroom. Okay, if I have 20 students, every student is going to get called on, perhaps more than once, because sometimes students will sort of like, okay, called on me, I can sort of lay back. You have to be able to keep everyone interested all the time, and the question itself should ensure that. You always have to look for the bridge to what is meaningful and for the students. But cold calling is one way of doing that. And again, it goes to climate. You have to create a climate in which the students do feel comfortable in sharing what they understand. That's extremely important, because otherwise, you're not educating, I think, in the best sense of the word. Okay. Now, another thing is that one is finding the dialectic in the students. Okay, so there are moments when one will be the gadfly and when it's challenging to bring out another perspective, perhaps to get them to look at another point of view. But very often, I would say, there is always going to be a contrast of perspectives within the classroom. Okay, so to be able to have the students feel comfortable to bring that out is very, very effective. And so one elicits those views and they're willing to share them. And one does have to be careful that things don't get heated, right? I mean, sometimes you'll have to prepare the students if you're doing a controversial topic. You'll have to do some background, make sure that you have the ground rules and so forth, because, emotion can gallop away. But, that's a given. That's important probably at any age of life. But in any event, you will always be able to find dialectic within the students. And so you should look for it. It's there. And then one is trying to bring out the reasoning, the evidence, for these diverse claims, and see which one, as it were, is more appropriate, or perhaps, is there a reason that one can reasonably disagree and so forth. Okay, so the point of the Socratic method really is that you are trying to make the reasoning visible. You're trying to make the reasoning visible, and you're trying to extend it. And so gadfly moments, as it were, are basically, trying to bring out other perspectives on that. Okay, so these are the heart of the Socratic. These are the elements of the Socratic method. Now, one element which I have not put here, which you will see within the dialogues, is what is called the leading question, but I don't think of it as the leading question. All right. So often Socrates is using, I call them statement questions, in which he's saying, he's saying something with a question mark, so it looks like a leading question, but he really is sort of holding up an idea and saying, would you agree with this? Okay, and so there is the choice on the part of the person to agree or to disagree. And if there is a disagreement, then you have to, as it were, find another path. So I don't think leading questions have that much role within the classroom. They can. I mean, in the past, some teachers have suggested that they're useful for weaker students. I don't know if that's necessarily true. If there's a particularly thorny question of logic and reasoning, this can, as it were, sort of walk one through it pace by pace. Okay, but that would be another element which I don't think finds its way into the classroom very often. Okay, so this is the core. These are the core elements, I think, which you will choose for your own adaptation. Okay, let's see here. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Okay, so what do I bring into the classroom? Okay, if I'm a teacher, I want to use the Socratic method. What am I going to bring into the classroom? Okay, so regardless of the domain, you really need problems. Okay, you need open-ended problems. You need problems, word problems, perhaps within mathematics. I shouldn't say open-ended in that context. You need to bring scenarios in the sense that Dr. House did, which permit issues to be examined and explored by the students. Then you need a framework of questions. This could be a list of questions, yes, but very often I think it's good to have, as it were, a schema of questions, which over the course of a semester or a year, one intends to inculcate within the students as a manner of approaching a particular kind of problem. Okay. And so, within math, there will be a certain schema. Within history, there would be a different schema. For literature, it would be a different schema, and so forth. Okay. So having a framework of questions which you keep in your head, right? So it's good to write things out and so forth and be aware of the possible answers. But if one is, as it were, actively teaching, one is actively teaching, you can't always be looking down. You have to really be able to carry the lesson and the questions within your head, and you kind of know where you're going with it, with the different, with the different students that you have within the classroom. Okay. Now, time has flown by, but let me just tell you briefly where it can go wrong. Okay, so it can go wrong, not dramatically, I think. Okay, I don't think you're going to see it like sort of like crumble and you're disappeared under the structure, as it were. But I think if you're not using, for example, open questions, particularly at the beginning, if you're just using, as it were, recitation questions, or what in Italian, well, I don't know, it's perhaps being unfair, but interrogazione in Italian, where there's sort of quizzes or tests orally, which can be very memory based. If you're using basically questions which are only eliciting memory-based material, you haven't gotten, that can be part of it, but it shouldn't, as it were, be the soul of it. All right, so you do need questions which are permitting the students to analyze, which are drawing out their analysis, their thinking, their judgments, and such. Another fault, which is common, one of the more common faults, perhaps, is that one teaches only a few students within the classroom. Okay, so, if you're teaching only, 4 or 5 students who are participating, not a good thing. All right, so you want, as I say, I try to call on everyone, and usually I'm successful and it's not so hard, but you don't want to sort of narrow it down to 4 or 5 students who are very articulate. You have to have a sense that of what each student can bring out into the discussion. You have to allow time for processing. Perhaps you want to do pre-calling. That is, you're telling a student, look, I'm going to ask you such and such a question beforehand, so think about it, and we'll come back to that, and that sort of thing. All right, so you do not want to teach only a few students within the class, and leave everyone else sort of bored or apparently interested but not really interested, and that sort of thing. So that, I'm looking through the list here. I don't think if someone does make a wrong answer, don't pounce. I mean, the idea is that, Socratic teaching, that you bring out, demonstrate, lead the student, as it were, to recognize how it is wrong. And then one is, as it were, able to turn the corner in a more effective way, that one has learned from a mistake. All right. And mistakes are important. And when we learn more from mistakes, obviously, than from, the right things that we do, until you make a mistake, you haven't, in a sense, started learning. Okay, so I would say that you don't want to shift into debate mode. I think that is something which is, could be a danger as well. I don't think in most cases it's important, and one has to make one's peace with this, and depending on the domain, to enunciate what you yourself think or believe. Okay, I think it will always be present within what the students are saying, and it's not as if, as it were, that every answer is correct. But I think at this particular, well, it depends on what level one is teaching. But say, for example, within high school, they're often reliant upon authority. Okay, which can be a good thing in some sense, to some degree, but you're trying to stretch them, as it were, to challenge them to more self-reliant thinking. Okay, and so if one is, as it were, giving the right answer in some sense, then then that can, I think, inhibit that. It makes them continue to be reliant on authority. Okay, and so I think that that is something which one has to come to terms with, within one's own particular domain, and whatever context that you are working with. Okay, so but those are some of the ways I think that it can go wrong, is basically that. You must create the climate for students to share what they genuinely think, okay? And that's hugely important. Until that is done, then you're not going to have effective discussions, effective Socratic discussions. I mean, the whole point of Socratic method is that you're bringing out their ideas and seeing, what happens with them. Okay, you are the midwife, as it were, and you're trying to, bring into light what they truly think, what they truly believe. And it is immensely worthwhile to do this. Okay, now, after this, I would say it is very important to reflect on the experience. Okay, so a teaching journal, perhaps you do it, perhaps you don't do it, is very, very helpful. If one is very busy, it's hard to keep up with it, but to have a Google Doc or a physical, a paper journal, teaching journal is very, very helpful. Okay, that you can keep track of what are the good questions, what are the good scenarios, and you can sort of catch yourself to think, well, I'm doing too much of this, or one of the last things one wants to do, in any particular class, I would argue, is summarize. You want to summarize what was done in that particular lesson through that particular discussion. Okay, so someone just come in. Sorry, I got distracted there. And so reflection on the experience, on the teaching experience in general, is a great idea. Okay, regardless of the methods that one is using. But on the Socratic experience, I think it is immensely helpful that one is going through the questions one asked, going through how they were received. Now, it's also true that every class is different. Every class is different. I mean, over the years, one will see that students will respond to certain open questions in certain ways, so you can see the pattern. But nonetheless, how that is processed in any particular group is going to be very, very different. And so there's always something to be learned. This is something which is quite fascinating in itself. You have to be genuinely curious about what the students are thinking, why they are thinking it, and bringing it out into the open, and then seeing where it goes, seeing where the ideas go. Okay, and so I would say that. So why is the Socratic method important? I think principally because it does teach self-reliant critical thinking, right? That you are reasoning through issues, scenarios, problems, logically, with good judgment, cooperatively with other students, and one is gaining both discussion skills, one is gaining skills in cooperating with others, and one is deepening one's understanding of the material. This can be done within the full gamut of subjects. Okay, so it can be done within mathematics, within history, within literature, within the natural sciences, within this history of art, then apart from, say, the law and clinical medicine and so forth, it can be done, as Hilda Taba demonstrated, within elementary school, and there are other books which explore this. Okay, so it is important for deepening the students' personal analysis, personal understanding, personal judgments. It really is something which continues to deepen across the years. It's continually fascinating, and I think that it's important, and that's why it has remained important over the centuries. One visibly sees the path of Socratic method, from the Renaissance in clinical method in clinical medicine all the way to the present. Within legal studies. Even before Langdell introduced it at Harvard University, one could see it in the 1870s. One could see it in books decades before that. It is something which is just immensely helpful for any teacher. And I think that sort of brings us to the question time. All right. And so I've done an awful lot of talking, but I'm curious about your questions or reactions or observations. Okay. So let me see. I shall let the moderator, I think, return. Okay.
Hi, Eric.
Okay. Yeah.
All good. You want to proceed with the Q&A part?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Great. Okay. So, well, first, let me thank you for this very interesting webinar. I was listening was paying very much attention to it, to be honest. And I think most of the people in the chat, because I see here some comments. I saw we don't have many questions, to be honest, but I saw the input of some people, for example, how they used the Socratic method. If you want me to read them to you, we still have some
No,
time.
please
So,
do. Yes.
yeah, for example, Stavroula mentioned that as I have taught physics and geography in junior secondary schools for 25 years, she has applied the Socratic method in teaching, and it is making learning more interesting, attractive, and more interactive.
Yes, I completely agree. That's been my experience as well. Highly interactive, always interesting to the students, and they look forward to classes, and the more interactive, so one has, as it were, to be a very neutral moderator, giving space for the students. Okay, so if one were to continue to share, I think this, I think that, I think this, then the students, have less time, less space, and they're, sort of, as it seems to be sort of suggesting that they should take your view. All right. So one, by withdrawing, gives them space to, to think more actively for themselves. So I completely agree. I think it's quite fascinating.
Indeed, if the students also feel involved, that they are part of the discussion in the classroom, their voices can be heard. I think it's also more not just interesting, but encouraging as well for them, I would say, because they feel that yes, my voice will be heard, my questions will be addressed, and I'm not just a passive receiver of the information, for example.
Exactly.
So, if I may also read one more, it's a question from what I see here. Yanis is asking, I had seen a Socratic seminar some years ago in a high school in the United States. I remember it was very interesting to observe, but I do remember it followed a specific structure, especially with regard to students taking turns speaking and not interrupting their classmates. They were also seated in a circle. Are there any rules to organizing such a discussion that you could share with us?
Yes. Now the Socratic circles, it's one variation of Socratic method, which has become very popular. And one can find different books on it. One book in particular is Matthew Copeland's Socratic Circles, which is in print, which is written several years ago at this point. But basically, it's using a technique from the 1940s and what was called tea training, in which they use a fishbowl discussion. And I myself, I don't, to me, it does introduce a degree of passivity within the students. All right. So a fishbowl discussion in the 1940s, long before Socratic circles, was basically two circles. The inner circle was discussing and the outer circle was observing. Okay. And so Socratic circles have embraced that, in addition to having questions with regard, to examining, say, literature or what have you, different kinds of documents. And so, this is a go-to method in which the students will prepare for the discussion beforehand. There are assigned readings, and so they're able to come in prepared for the discussion. But there is sort of the participants and the observers. And, I'm not comfortable with the observer part of that, but it is a popular method. I've known teachers who use it, and the students, prepare very deeply for the discussions. They participate actively. So that is Socratic in a sense, but you don't, as it were, you don't have the Socratic moderator. It's Socratic in a different way. I think, chiefly because it's making use of questions, but this fishbowl technique, emerged only within the 1940s within so-called tea groups, and was used for therapy. That was for therapy and such. So it has sort of interesting intellectual history. Yeah.
Thank you for the insightful reply. I was aware of the fishbowl, let's say, conversations, the fishbowl technique in the schools, but well, you delved deep into it. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. Are you okay with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, I learned from the questions too. Yeah.
I would like then to combine two questions. First of all, a question that I had myself: how can you get a Sci student, encourage a Sci student to get involved in a discussion, and also if you can give us some examples of how this technique can be implemented in with primary school students. You don't have to give us a whole learning activity, or maybe something from your own experience.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll start with the second part of that. All right. So with primary school students, Hilda Taba did this, in the 1960s. She was from Estonia and immigrated to the United States. She went to Columbia, became very influential in curriculum development in the middle of the 20th century, and had a distinctively Socratic approach to education. And there is a book by Durkin, I want to say Ellen Durkin, regarding her method of approaching conversations. Apart from that, one very, very helpful way of approaching discussions in elementary school is to use thinking routines. Okay, so Harvard's Project Zero with Ron Richard and others, they published a very beautiful book, very helpful book called Making Thinking Visible, right? Making Thinking Visible, in which you have different thinking routines, which are usually 3-4 step routines, which are scaffolding thinking. All right. So, the shortest routine is simply know what makes you say that. Okay. Which is, to draw out what people think. But see, think, wonder. See, think, wonder, which some of you perhaps have heard of, walks the students through, what they observe, what it makes them think, what it makes them wonder. All right. And so you have thinking routines which can be implemented in at any level of education, really. But it's something which is, I think, very applicable to elementary school education, but it can be used anywhere. I mean, Richard, in an anecdote in one of his lectures, talks about how one of the Project Zero people was talking to a doctor who was trying to help her sister, through cancer or something, and the doctor wasn't really giving very, very helpful information. So she led him through see, think, wonder in order to get a better understanding of what her sister's condition was. What do you see? What does it make you think? What does it make you wonder? In using other words, but basically thinking routines are extremely useful. It's a very, very helpful way of approaching it's a simple schema, a useful schema though, which has many applications. All right, now the first part of the question regarded science education. Okay, so it's going to basically, depend on what kind of question you are asking within science. I mean, if something regarding photosynthesis, you could ask, the broad question, of what basically causes the plants to gain energy. What is it within the cells? When you're trying to, given that they have reviewed this beforehand, lead them to articulate an understanding of what photosynthesis is. This can be done with broad questions. You can just start off, why are there 4 seasons? Okay, and and try to get them to, to articulate, if they have understood this already, that is, that they have read about it. It's not simply the Earth going around the sun. It has to do as well, with the rotation, with the tilt of the Earth, and which hemisphere is pointing towards the sun, during its orbit, its year-long orbit, and so forth. I mean, so you can start with different kinds of questions and then scaffold the understanding through further questions. And so you can also look at, obviously, if you look at science and ethics, you're able to find many open questions which will permit the examination of different perspectives on that. Okay, so it's I guess it depends on the kinds of problems you're examining, within the science classroom. Okay.
Thank you very much for the reply. And regarding the thinking routines, you just gave me a great pass because at the same time, there is a course running on the European School Education platform. However, it is only addressed to e-twinners. So if anyone from this audience is an e-twinner, is a teacher coming from the e-twinning community, feel free to enroll. You will find a lot of useful information about the thinking routines and the thinking and making thinking and learning technique approach, let's say, there. So feel free, to take a look into it. Eric, thank you very much for making this great pass.
Okay.
To be honest. And we have 2 more minutes. Maybe we can reply to a last question, one more last question.
Certainly.
Great.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let me go back to the questions. I would, okay. I think we have a statement maybe here. It's a statement, I think. It is also very interdisciplinary and involves all students by making them knowledge researchers. Don't you think so?
Yes, I think it is interdisciplinary. I mean, interdisciplinary education, I think, is immensely helpful because it's very it's very easy to become compartmentalized. And so if one can bring art to science, science to art, art to history, and so forth, it really does help the students to connect the dots. It's very easy to remain with, the walls around one, and one is, as it were, within a maze. And so to be able to bring different ideas into interaction, this is extraordinarily helpful. It makes the learning much more authentic and real. It roots it more deeply within the students' lives. Okay, it's very easy to be cloistered for whatever reason. It has to do with how we think. And so if one is drawing the connections or, putting the dots down, it helps, the students to connect them. And so Socratic method can do that. You can, structure the experiences, the sequence of questions, the problems, which are drawing out different aspects of interdisciplinary work. So this certainly is very, very true. There's just limitless possibilities with that. It depends. The creativity of the teacher is extremely important. A lot of work can be done with that always. It's very, very interesting. Okay.
Well, but yes, what I would like to say is that indeed, well, teaching is a profession that gives you a lot of space to create, to work with your students, collaborate. Of course, there will always be some challenges. We as teachers, we come across many challenges, but I think we are, I don't know, somehow skilled to fight them and overcome them. And using exploring different approaches and different methods always helps us get better, of course, and maybe come closer to our students, help our students as well. And one of these methods is what we would say very student-centered. It puts indeed the student into the center.
Yes.
Well, I would like to thank you, Eric. Let me close with some information about the upcoming events on the European School Education platform. Please don't miss the upcoming webinar. It's on the 24th of March. You still have 1 month to enroll, but mark your calendars. In this webinar, engaging maths education through games, technology, and interdisciplinary learning, sorry. You will have the opportunity to explore a project about maths and how we can make mathematics more interesting and more innovative, let's say, for our students. And of course, our 2 online courses that one of them is running already, and the other one is coming in almost 1 month. I would like now to thank our speaker, Eric. Thank you for your interesting and very, very valuable information that you have shared with us today. I saw many positive comments on the chat, people saying that it was very interesting, and it was very enlightening. Yes. Thank you very much all. We hope to see you soon in our future webinars, and have a great evening, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.